People go to many different places around the world, and a lot of the time they are safe. But there are a select handful of people that go to places that they end up wishing that they never went, because a lot of the time they either get seriously injured or have a traumatic experience, or even unfortunately they die. And so in today's video we're going to look at 3 stories where people have went somewhere and regretted it. But before we begin, if true crime stories intrigues your interest, then I would highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do and I upload once a week. But with all that being said, let's begin. Our first story of today's video starts off with a man named Larry El Murialo Mukanda. Larry was a normal guy who lived a normal life for some time anyway. He would grow up in a city called Council Bluffs, which was a city in Iowa. Council Bluffs was a relatively good place to live in, and it was home to 63,000 people. There were many things to do in this city, so you'll never find yourself bored or have any excuse to do something stupid or crazy. But there would be one specific place where things would change for Larry for the worse. Growing up for him was pretty hard as well, since he was shy and quite awkward. He wouldn't really make many friends, and unfortunately this loneliness would really take a toll on him. When he got to his early 20s, he just kind of found himself living life on autopilot. This would lead Larry to do things and to have things that he really shouldn't have had, and from these things would spark Larry's erratic and wild behaviour, and in turn his parents would get worried for him. But it would be on November 28th, 2009 where things would change for the worst. It was a cold winter's evening, and the weather had picked up to the point where there was a full-blown snowstorm. Larry had just finished his shift at the local supermarket, where he had been working to earn some extra cash, and also this job gave him something to do. So he would slowly walk to his front door, moving left and right and not really walking in a straight line. And as he opened the door, right away he would be confronted by his parents, and this would start a massive argument. And this argument would cause Larry to run out the house, literally with no clothes on, no shoes on, and without his car keys. And he would run into the snowstorm and unfortunately never come back. Leading up to this fight, Larry had begun to start hallucinating and basically become disorientated. This of course would be very worrying for his parents, especially for his mother after seeing him going through this for a while. She would take him to the doctors where they would prescribe him with antidepressants. But unfortunately this wouldn't help Larry at all. In fact, it would make it 10 times worse, to the point where his hallucinations would become more worse, and he would begin to hear voices in his head. These voices would tell him many things, such as when he was walking in the night, these voices would tell him someone's following him and he should be careful, because if he doesn't, he'll die. The voices would also tell him to eat sugar all the time, because randomly Larry's heart would begin to pound really fast. And when I say randomly, it's mainly due to anxiety that he goes through on a daily basis. And his voices would tell him to eat sugar as they calm your heartbeat down. And again, on the day of the argument, when Larry was walking into the house, he would become more irrational and would start making less and less sense. This would frustrate his parents because they weren't getting a clear answer of what was going on with Larry. And so this was the key factor on their big argument. About 20 to 30 minutes later, a search would be sent out for Larry, but somehow Larry wouldn't be found. The police of course were dumbfounded on how a man, who again wasn't all there in the head, would disappear in a matter of 20 minutes while walking in a snowstorm without any shoes on. And unfortunately Larry would stay undiscovered. But before you click off the video, something would happen a whole 10 years later after his disappearance that will shock you, because it definitely shocked me. So January of 2019, so a whole 10 years later, after the fact that Larry went missing, a contractor was hired to remove shelves in a local supermarket that had been closed down in 2016. So they of course would begin to move shelves until they got to the freezer section of the supermarket. And as they began to move shelves across the freezer section, a couple of minutes later, the police were called. Wedged in an 18-inch gap between the cooler and the wall was a badly decomposed body. So of course the police would come and would take this body out, and straight away they couldn't tell on who this could be, as the body had entered its final stages of decomposition. The authorities noticed the blue hooded sweatshirt and white blue pants that would match the description of what Larry was last wearing before ultimately he disappeared. And after gathering DNA samples, the police found out that yes, that was Larry. Now how Larry got there was strange, but employees would go out their way to tell the police that employees would climb onto the storage place and use it as an unofficial break room. But for Larry, this wouldn't be the case. Authorities believe that Larry wanted to get to this storage room, but wound up falling 12 feet behind a cooler. And well, since coolers make an obnoxiously loud noise, that no matter how loud Larry screamed or kicked, no one would be able to hear him. There were no sign of trauma on his body, so police classified it as an accidental death. Another thing was 10 years ago, when Larry had first gone missing, his mother would tell the police to go check out the supermarket, as she thought that he could be there, which of course the police did, but no one could ever imagine that he would end up behind a cooler. A man woke up from a nice nap and he looked at the time and saw it was 3, so he would hop on the shower and then get dressed and prepare himself. The man was going on a date with a woman that he just met. As some time went by, and the man and the woman would meet up at the selected restaurant. And as the date was going on, unfortunately the man knew that there was no chemistry between them. And the woman could also see that to be the fact as well. So now nearing the end of the date, the man's feeling a bit bummed out that this isn't working. So he did something that he would never usually do. But at this rate, he was like, why the hell not? He would turn to the woman and ask her, hey, do you want to go on this canyon called Provo Canyon? You know, we could go on a walk there. I've been there a couple of times myself and the views are amazing. And since it was dark outside, you'll be able to see all the stars. So it's going to look amazing if you come. And amazingly, the woman said, sure, why not? And pretty quickly, the two would find themselves getting into the man's car and driving towards this hiking spot. The two would eventually arrive and they would park up. And now it's dark outside. And so the two were getting excited to see this view. So they would get out the car and begin their walk. As they're walking, they're pretty excited, especially the man, because he can see that the woman's kind of enjoying this. But this is where the excitement would fade. The man would be the first to start doubting his plan of going here, as he becomes more and more on edge. Why? Because he's getting the feeling that someone's watching him. And later on, he would find out that the woman had the same feeling as him. But anyways, the man didn't want to ruin the plan, ruin the whole date, so he just kept on pushing forward. And as they got deeper and deeper, they began to walk faster and faster until they were basically sprint walking. Both of them were doing this because both of them kind of wanted this to end. But both of them were telling themselves in their head that they didn't want to ruin the plan. So we'll just keep on walking, but just a bit faster. So practically again, speed walking. They would continue walking until they got to a section where there's just trees on each side. And the two would freeze because they just heard a bush rustling. And as they stopped because they heard the bush rustling, the man would step on something that he described as soft. And of course, with having no idea on what this soft thing could be, the man just stood still, and so did the woman. And without any words exchanged, both of them would turn around and get the heck out of there. Once they got inside the car, the two would stop and breathe, and eventually break out in laughter, because what they experienced was pretty scary, but now they're finding the funny side of it. A whole 10 years later, the two would actually get married, many thanks to that main experience that they had together. So now again, 10 years later, both of them would be sitting in the living room with the TV on, and they were watching this true crime TV show. And at the time, neither of them were really watching the show. They were kind of dozing off until an interview came on about a journalist who was interviewing a death row inmate. This inmate was very famous and was close to his execution date. And during this interview, the journalist would ask the death row inmate, was there ever a time you almost got caught? And this man would go, yes, there was a time I was in Provo Canyon and I had just murdered a woman. And at the time, I was trying to dispose of her body and I was dragging it across the main pathway of this canyon. And this young couple would randomly turn around the corner and would begin walking towards me. So I hopped in a bush, had one hand on the body, and I watched as the couple began to walk closer and closer to the body until one of them stepped on the body. And as they stepped on the body, I was watching them maybe a foot away, waiting to see their reaction. And I had the full intention, if they started investigating, I had to kill them. But for some reason, they would turn around and run away. So that was the time where I almost got caught. So now the couple are watching the interview with horror on their face, because they knew that couple that he was talking about was them. And the person that was being interviewed was the most famous serial killer of all time, Ted Bundy. And this couple was only a foot away from the most notorious killer. On November 19th, 2019, Russia was experiencing one of its coldest months, and so as accustomed, hot water would be sent through these pipes into business and residential homes. But on the same day, the Russian city of Penza, which is about 340 miles south of Moscow, had a large hot water pipe burst underground below a car park. And at first, no one had any idea that there was a pipe that had been burst. But eventually, when steam began to arise from the ground where the pipe had burst, people knew that there's something wrong over there. Our main character's 49-year-old Vladimir Valijekin was driving his car through this car park. He wasn't alone though. He was accompanied with his co-worker, 53-year-old Igor Chikasov. Together, both men worked at a furniture store. But anyways, they would make their way towards the car park exit, of course to leave. And there was another car in front of them leaving. And they watched as the car in front of them rolled over this steamy section of the car park. And so without any hesitation, two had enough evidence that they could also too go over this steamy section. And so that's what they did. And as soon as the full weight of the car was on top of this steamy section off the ground, the floor would collapse. Now what the men did not know that, yes, there was something going on because there was steam coming out from the floor. They weren't expecting that there was a pipe that had been burst, injecting thousands of gallons of water into the soil, right under the pavement, which created a sinkhole. This sinkhole is where the earth collapses on itself, creating what we call a sinkhole. They're formed when water dissolves the rock layer underneath the soil, and they can range from being tiny sinkholes to absolutely massive ones. But typically sinkholes are quite easy to spot, so a lot of people avoid them. But in this case, the men did fall into a sinkhole, but it wasn't just any ordinary sinkhole. This sinkhole was slowly filling up with boiling water. And another shocking fact was, when the men fell into the sinkhole, their car would flip upside down. And not only that though, the sinkhole was just big enough so the car would fit, and so that meant that the men couldn't open the door because the walls on the side were holding the door shut. This also meant that they couldn't even roll the windows down, since again the walls were in the way. So practically they had no chance of escape apart from the front window. So the men calmly, I guess you could say, would unbuckle the seatbelts and began to kick the front window. And as they began to kick this front window, they noticed that it wasn't breaking whatsoever. And this is where the calmness would be thrown out the window and the men would begin to scream. Onlookers could hear the men as they were watching from above, but everyone knew that was watching them. There was nothing they could do because jumping in there is basically a death sentence. So they just watched in horror as the two men desperately tried to escape the car, but the boiling water continued to fill up this hole until eventually filling up the car. And at that point, that's when the two men went silent, and eventually the car was fully submerged under boiling water to the point where you couldn't even see the car at all. Although not held criminally responsible, the water company that owned the water pipes offered to pay compensation to both families as well as cover all funeral costs. So that'll be it for today's video. If true crime stories intrigues your interest, then I would highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do and I upload once a week. But with all that being said, I thank you for watching, and yeah, goodbye.